I am very happy to see you all again, even if it is online. We have been working together with Stiftung Mercator for a number of years, the very productive partnership. We've been working on Turkey-EU-Germany relations, climate change, in which there are a number of issues we've been actually researching on and trying to come up with policy recommendations that would help the governors or stakeholders to deal with the global challenges, which is vast and very unprecedented. Today, we decided to have a twofold webinar. One focus on the recent big issue of climate. As you know, there has been upsurge of interest in climate change and global warming, and recently, especially after the American presidential elections, with the success of Joe Biden, United States has focused on climate in relation to unemployment issues, not only working on climate, but also actually working on it in terms of creating new job opportunities to deal with one of the unprecedented challenges of our times, unemployment and especially youth unemployment. So we decided to focus on our general issue, Turkey-Germany relations, from the angle of the Green Deal, but to do so, especially in relation to enhancing Turkey-EU relations in such a way that would actually also help to partners, especially Turkey, to deal with unemployment issues. The second part of today, this afternoon's gathering is a webinar on Syrians. There's another actually big issue, big challenge. We have just entered the second decade of the Syrian Syrian crisis, in which the humanitarian issue is extremely important in relation to those people who have been forced to flee their homes. In the second part, we will be focusing on another key issue in Turkey-Germany relations, which is the Syrian issue, in terms of what has been called recently dealing with precarity, dealing with those who are actually under the situation of precarity. So I am very happy to see my friends, to be with you again in one of our webinars, the IPC Mercator webinars, and thank you very much for attending. And now I pass the floor to my friend from Stiftung Mercator, Anne Duckner. Please, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fuat, and dear guests and friends. It's an honor to also welcome you on behalf of Stiftung Mercator to our joint webinar with the IPC. My name is Anne Düncker, and I'm the director of Stiftung Mercator's Department Europe in the World. First of all, I want to say I hope everybody got well through the full lockdown. I can imagine that this has been exhausting weeks, and I hope that you could now enjoy Bayram and a little bit of good time with your families and regain some energy. Today's discussion touches upon various topics which are also of very crucial importance to our foundation and that form an integral part of the new strategy that has just came into force this year. For our Europe department, in the new strategy, cooperation with Turkey will continue to play a central role for us. In addition, we focus on cohesion and the rule of law in Europe and also on relations with China. The Mercator Foundation as a whole will continue to work on climate issues, on cohesion and participation, especially in Germany, and also as a new field on digitalization. But as I've said, our work on Turkey is truly important for us, and we know that the relations between Turkey and Europe have become more difficult, and also not too many actors are still around in the field to fund exchange between Turkey and Europe. So this is really especially important to us. And we want to work towards a trustful and constructive partnership despite all difficulties. We do this through scientific analysis and by promoting encounters between academics, between civil society, youngsters, teachers, and between politicians and decision makers. So we try to support concrete initiatives that help to ensure that Europe has a reliable partner in Turkey and vice versa, especially in matters of foreign policy, security, and migration, but also in regards to mitigation of climate change. Such engagement, of course, requires partners that share a long-term commitment. And I'm really glad that we have found such partners at Sabancı University and Istanbul Policy Center. So thank you especially to you, Fuat, Keyman, also to Senem, Aydın-Düzgit, and the whole IPC team for such a fruitful partnership. This is really important for us. And I believe we not only share the building in Karaköy with you, but also our heartfelt engagement for trustful relations between Turkey and the wider Europe, and our belief that encounters and dialogue, even in difficult times, are without alternative. And we want to make, if we want to make the world a more peaceful place and sustainable place, we need to work together and we need the exchange with each other. So thank you very much to all of you for making this happen. Thank you today for your time and participation, and I'm looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Shall I take over from here directly? Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne, for this great introduction to today's event. It's very nice to see you, even though online. And I also have to reiterate that we are extremely pleased with our cooperation and our, of course, also personal friendship with Mercator and yourself over the years, which I think also resulted in many valuable works in the policy community, and some of which, of course, we're going to be hearing more about today as well. So thanks very much. Okay, so without further ado, I think we can begin our first panel. Now, our first panel will be on the European Green Deal and EU-Turkey relations. And we have three speakers on this panel, so I'm going to introduce them first. The first speaker will be Philipp Godron, who is responsible for international energy policies and global energy transition at Agora Energy. I hope I pronounced this one correctly. So Philipp, very happy to see you. And Philipp will be telling us about the European Green Deal and European targets in particular regarding the deal, and also climate neutrality and its potential impact on the EU's external relations. If, Philipp, we can keep it around 12 to 14 minutes or so max, I think that would be great, so that we can have enough time for discussion as well. Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senem. Thank you also, Fuat, Keyman, and Anne Düncker for the support of Istanbul Policy Center, Mercator, and the great collaboration that I can underline that we have also encountered during the last 4 years. I also personally in collaborating with Istanbul Policy Center, in particular on our common initiative on working on the energy transition, where we have built the Shura Energy Transition Center together and collaborated on that. I will give an introduction, as you said, on the EU Green Deal, the implications and interdependence with German energy and climate policy, and of course, the Turkey-EU relations. Can we see the presentation? Excellent. And let's move on to the next slide, please. Very briefly, Agora Energy, we are a think tank and policy lab placed in Berlin, working not only on the German energy transition, but also in the meantime, globally with partners, think tank partners in 10 to 12 countries around the world that have a challenging environment for the energy transition. Our vision is a prosperous and carbon neutral global economy by 2050 and has been for a number of years. We have our headquarters in Berlin, and myself, I am living and working in Berlin. In the meantime, we also have offices in Brussels, Beijing, and Bangkok. Next slide. Now, although we are talking about the EU Green Deal, I still would like to give a perspective, and actually a very encouraging perspective that the last few years have brought. Some of you may have seen the new IEA report, Net Zero by 2050, which was published 2 days ago. It's the first time the IEA has developed a global pathway for net zero emissions by the year 2050. I think it's a milestone for an institution which a number of years ago was very far away from this perspective, but it is also reflecting a trend that we have seen in the last 2 years, and this is what the graph here shows, of more and more countries committing, pledging for net zero emissions by 2050, some a bit earlier, some as China, namely a bit later by 2060. And counting the population and GDP and CO2 emissions, we actually see that in particular when it comes to GDP and CO2 emissions, countries representing around 70% of global GDP and 70% of, more than 70% of global CO2 emissions have pledged to become carbon neutral by 2050. So this is together, of course, with the Paris Agreement, a very encouraging trend that we are seeing in the last years. Now turning to Europe on the next slide. The EU in December 2019, as most of you will know, has announced the European Green Deal, which is in effect, and this was announced by the incoming new commission headed by Ms. von der Leyen. It's a comprehensive strategy which, if you boil it down, really puts climate neutrality and carbon emission reduction center stage to European politics, linking it with economic well-being and innovation. There are many, many angles to it: circular economy, agriculture, buildings, transport, industry, energy. This will require a lot of public and private investments that are oriented towards climate protection and sustainability, which will be the clear trend on the European and the EU side. There's a just transition mechanism taking into account and respecting the fact that there are particular regions, particular countries, particular industries that will bear a specific burden in transformation. And it's also about mainstreaming climate protection, both in the internal market and foreign trade. And that, of course, has important implications for EU-Turkey relations, as well as for all trade relations around the world that the EU is encountering. I would like to, in the following 7 to 10 minutes, bring a bit of a perspective on what this means for a country like Germany, that is both obviously affected by the EU Green Deal and it's also influencing the implementation of the EU Green Deal, and shed light on 2 specific issues, briefly share some thoughts on the question of just transition, employment, jobs, social issues, as well as the impact on industry and trade relations, in particular with Turkey. If you look at the next slide. On the German side, we have, as Agora Energy vendor, a few weeks ago published a report that has developed based on a quantitative, in-depth assessment, a roadmap for climate neutral Germany by 2045. What we did not expect when we developed this report is that only 2 days after this report was published, the German Constitutional Court, in a rather unexpected ruling, declared the climate law of the government that had been passed in 2019 unconstitutional, as it was putting too much of the burden to climate neutrality to later generations. There had been a lawsuit filed by a group of young people, could say around the Fridays for Future movement, and the court partly accepted their claim that too little was being done in the next 10 to 15 years, and therefore limiting the freedom to future generations. And in a hasty political move ahead of the new parliamentary elections coming in September, within 2 weeks, the climate ambition for Germany has been increased by the government considerably, targeting 2045 as a carbon neutral target date, and increasing the ambition level for the year 2030 considerably. And this is actually very close to what we had proposed in this publication. If we look at the next slide, so I'm referring to this. I don't want you to look at all these details here. There's just 3 main messages. How can Germany become carbon neutral by 2045? And we see 3 steps. Step 1, and if you click on the slide again, is by 2030, we have to phase out coal. We have to ramp up electric mobility, calculating 14 million of electric cars, and introduce hydrogen for the industrial sector. That will allow us to reduce carbon emissions by 65%. The previous target had been 55%, as compared to 1990 levels by 2030. Secondly, beyond 2030, only carbon-free technologies will be installed in industry, electricity, heating, and transport, which means that all investments, but also all research will go in carbon-free technologies from now on. And step 3, beyond 2045, there will be around 5% non-avoidable greenhouse gas emissions, mainly coming from agriculture, cement production, and these will have to be offset by biomass carbon capture and storage. So basically countering negative emissions that are offsetting these. So it's possible. And actually there was, I was relating to the IEA report earlier. This very similar pathway is being shown. There are differences, of course, by the IEA for the global economy. Next one, please. 2 elements I said I would like to briefly touch upon, and we can certainly come back to that in the discussion. Just transition. While this transformation offers huge opportunities, will require a lot of investment, will offer a lot of new jobs, there is going to be also losers. Certain regions, certain employments will get lost, and coal mining is certainly one at the forefront. This is why the EU has announced a just transition mechanism that would look at these industries and regions in particular. This affects parts of Germany, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, support them by a number of funds. And on the next slide, I'm relating this to an exercise that has been carried out in Germany around the decision to phase out coal, which was taken 2 years ago. Here, in a broad stakeholder involvement effort, a coal commission was set up involving environmental groups, trade unions, the energy industry, science, business, to come up with a plan that would take into account social issues while phasing out coal. So those groups directly affected were involved in the process. There is going to be substantial support for workers and regions to develop a low carbon economy and jobs, and adequate amount of time. Although we have to say now, with the increase in ambition, the coal phase out that was originally decided for 2038 will have to happen earlier. Second element I wanted to shed a brief highlight on, please let's go to the next slide again, is the impact of the EU Green Deal on relations between Turkey and the EU. You will know much better than I. There is, of course, a very intricate relationship and important relationship between Turkey and the EU. EU is Turkey's most important trade partner. Largest share of foreign investment is coming from the EU into Turkey, and there will be impact by the EU Green Deal. I just picked 3 areas that I think will be important. EU financial institutions, development banks will provide financing only for sustainable activities. Turkish companies that are delivering to the EU will, of course, have to adopt their strategies to sustainable and green businesses in order to avoid competitive disadvantages. And there may be advantages for EU companies, particularly in affected regions, for example, in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, that will benefit from the just adjustment mechanisms over Turkish competitors who may not. Very briefly on the next ones, one important element that's being discussed is around the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I don't want to go into detail, but industry will, of course, play an important role in achieving higher climate ambition. The numbers are here, but they're not so important. Industry is important. Industry needs to contribute. And this will mean looking at technologies that emit less CO2. On the next slide, we have just calculated for a number of important industries the additional cost coming from a CO2 price of 60 euro. I just looked it up this morning. We currently have more than 50 euros per ton of CO2. It has doubled in the last 6 months. And if you go to the next slide, we see the impact for different, for cement industry, it's going to be double the gross value added at a price of 60 euros. And then for others, aluminum is an increase of around 30% and others. So there is an impact. And in order to not lose competitiveness for those companies in the EU that have to go this pathway, the EU is planning, on the next slide again, please, to implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will actually create a level playing field between exporters, importers into the EU that are not bound to this legislation. Of course, we think that this is not a question of if such a mechanism will come. There's big commitment by all institutions, EU Commission, the Parliament, the Council, so it will come, and the big question will be to deliver it in a way that will rather focus on opportunities than trade barriers. And that brings me to my last slide. As Turkey has a number of industries that are exporting considerably into the EU, steel, aluminum, paper, and cement in particular, these businesses will be greatly affected. In order to look at the opportunities, companies will have to prepare. The Turkish government can help its own companies by supporting their green transformation, avoiding such adjustment mechanisms for exports to Europe. And the EU, from our point of view, should complement this mechanism by support for green transformation in their neighborhoods, so also for the Turkish industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Philipp, for this excellent presentation. And I think it set the general frame of the other two presentations and hopefully our discussion as well, in the sense that, you know, we see the targets, that there are challenges, but it looks like they might be manageable given the right policies. And it's obvious that this whole deal will have a huge impact on Turkey and certain more so for certain Turkish industries than others. And so there has to be the right preparation on this front as well, and hopefully with EU support. Now, within that, I'm going to come to the second presentation by Professor Fikret Adaman, who is a professor of economics at Boğaziçi University, who is also an IPC Mercator Senior Fellow. I know, and we know that he's been working also on the social aspects of the Green Deal, in particular regarding its relationship with growth. And Philipp, you've also, made that sort of connection in the sense that you talked about jobs and growth. I mean, when we listen, for instance, the US political discourse, any speech on the climate policy always goes together with job creation and growth. So where does growth and social protection figure in all this? I think this is a very, very valid and important question. And for that, we turn to Fikret Hocam. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Senem Hocam, for this introduction. And Philipp, thank you very much for this very concise presentation, which illuminated us about the carbon neutrality and the new Green Deal in Europe. Well, what I'm planning to do is to broaden a bit the discussion. Of course, the carbon neutrality issue is the issue, but there are other environmental issues like, biodiversity loss or plastic pollution or water shortage, and, you name the rest. So I would like to refer to ecological problems in its totality, but acknowledging that the climate crisis is the main, major problem there. And also, I would like to, as Senem signaled, I would like to introduce the social aspect as well, because as we all know, the new Green Deal is not just a transition towards a greener, cleaner technology, but also we aim at achieving a fairer, a more just society. So, and I would like to make my discussion with reference to Turkey, and therefore I would like to provide some, if you wish, snapshots on the political economy of the sustainability. I would like to, call sustainability because it includes the environmental dimension, but also the social and the economic ones as well. And of course, they are very much related with each other. So, yes, the environment, the society, and the economy, and I will be posing the question, where is the cook? And here, of course, the reference is Greenaway's movie, the cook, the thief, and so on and so forth. Well, let me start with providing two snapshots with regard to the performance of Turkey. The first comes from the Environmental Performance Index, compiled by the universities of Yale and Columbia, and I like this index very much. Well, according to this index, Turkey ranks 99th out of 180. And if you get into the index, then you would observe that you have two dimensions. The environmental health, which basically goes up with development because it deals with, waste management, sanitation, drinking water, and so on and so forth. So, if you are a bit richer, then you will have much possibilities to deal with these questions. But the second one is the ecosystem vitality, which is basically your ecological footprint over the ecology, and it's generally speaking negatively correlated with your development level. Unless you are green, unless you care about the environment. And the first dimension, environmental health, waits for the 40% of this index, and the remaining 60% comes from the ecosystem vitality. So as you can see, Turkey is above the world average, as you can see here, in terms of sanitation, heavy metals, waste management. Its performance is above the world average. But when you focus on the ecosystem vitality, the second dimension, well, then it fails, and a complete failure at the biodiversity and natural habitat. It ranks 175th out of 180 countries. I mean, it's basically terrible. And my second index is the well-known SDGs. And as you know, you have 17 goals, targets, dimensions, and each target coming with a set of measurements. And here Turkey ranks out of 166 as the 17th. And when you get into the details, and here you have the 17 dimensions, you have, your alarms ringing in dimensions 5, gender equality, 10, inequalities, 13, 14, 15, climate action. That's what Philipp has been talking about. The 14th one is the life below water. Then the 15th, life on land, and then on the 16th, we have peace, justice, and strong institutions. So here we have major challenges, and in most of the remaining dimensions, we have significant challenges, where we have the color orange, and in the no poverty dimension, we have some challenges remain. Well, we haven't achieved so far any of the sustainable development goals yet. And if we follow the figure, then we would be focusing on the trends. Well, there are some good news, all right? There are some improvements. But in the 16th, not surprisingly perhaps, we have a decreasing trend. So that's something that we need to keep in our minds. Well, when you look at the totality of environmental regulations in Turkey, and when you compare them with, developing countries' cases, then you would observe that the environmental legislation is quite developed in Turkey. Well, of course, there are important sort of holes. Perhaps the most obvious one is the fact that Turkey has not ratified yet the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a big question mark. And here I'm gonna put the sort of bridge to what Philipp has just said. Well, okay, we are trying to move towards a carbon neutral Europe, and here we have Turkey, which has not ratified yet the agreement. So when you look at the general overall picture, then you can see that the enforcement and implementation of this legislation is very weak, is rather weak. And then I have listed down some possible reasons to explain as of why the enforcement and implementation is weak. And here, of course, we have the administrative and institutional incapability. And then we have the high level of informality, on which I am going to talk in a minute. The third dimension is, I think, the most important one, is that the incumbent government seems to be favoring growth over the environment. So there is a kind of growth fetishism, which basically puts the legislation, at the other side. And well, obviously, you may want to ask to what extent the Turkish society overall has, environmental concerns, perhaps apart from a small pocket of people and apart from some think tanks and a few academics and few civil societies. And the last point, and perhaps something that we may want to discuss at a later stage, is that environmental politics here in Turkey seems to be conflated with other types of politics. So you do politics through the environment, and that brings lots of problems and questions. But as I said, we may turn back to this at a later stage. So let's switch to the societal side, and here I have the Gini coefficient of Turkey, which has been fluctuating around 40%. We made some progress in the 2006-8, and then recently we got worsened it. As you know, it's an index between 0 and 1. 0 is a society corresponding to a full equality, and 1 corresponding a society where I get everything and you people get nothing. And on the average, the figure would be around 30.3 in Europe, and something above 0.4 is really alarming. So the society here faces a real challenge there. And when you look at the economic side, then you would observe a huge presence of informality. 1/3 of the economy is informal. And plus, when you look at the labor force, 1/3, 1 out of 3 workers is working informally. And secondly, we have a structural unemployment problem. In situations when we grow, we can't sort of provide employment to our especially younger people. And the debt is going up both at the government side and at household side, which is again getting alarming for the next generation. And I would like to say a few lines with regards to the costs of informality. Well, informal work would come with low wages, no job guarantee, no retirement benefits, precarious work, so you don't know what will happen tomorrow. And we are not talking about 1 or 2% of your labor force. We are talking about 1/3. It's huge. And once in your economy you have a huge informal sector that doesn't pay attention to occupational health and safety standards, the former one would say, well, look, I mean, rather than looking whether I, satisfy the standards, why don't you go and check the informal one? And the formal sector would also reduce their standards. And we have been observing, hundreds of occupational accidents, and the fatality rate, as I will show you in a minute, is huge. And at the end of the day, because of the informality, the government is having serious difficulties in collecting taxes, on which I will say a few additional information in a second. When you look at the fatality rate, this tells us what? This is the incidence rate in the year 2018. That's the latest figure we have. Per 100,000 workers, the average fatality rate in Europe is around 1.6. So 1.6 workers got killed in 2018. And compare that rate with that of Turkey. It's close to 11. And this figure comes only from the formal sector. We don't know what's happening in the informal one. And we know that the bulk of the informality occurs at the construction sector, where the accident rate is huge. So we don't know what happens. But even we take the official, the formal figure, then it means that each and every day we lose 4.2 workers. So today, in about 8 hours time, you know, we will lose 4.2 workers. It's huge. Well, what about the tax revenues over the GDP? That's the standard sort of figure that we use in order to understand, you know, the extent of revenues that governments can get. And when you look at the European countries, well, it's around 35-40. For example, in Germany, we have and then Philipp, it's close to 40%. In some countries, more than 40. The average of OECD is 35. In Turkey, it's 25. This means what? This means that the Turkish government is having serious difficulties in collecting taxes. And of course, if you collect less, then this would mean that you would have less revenues for public services as well, to your health services, to your education services. You will have less money to spend on. And I would like to come from that to the poverty trap that I see reproducing itself in Turkey. Now, to wrap up, we have seen that 1/3 is in the informal sector. They earn less money. And by and large, these families are around the poverty line. Perhaps not below the poverty line, but just, you know, at or just tiny bit above the poverty line, which means that they are very much fragile. So what happens is that their children's human capital would be low. Why? Because poor families have to send their children at work as soon as possible. So once they get 16, 17, they will be forced to work in the labor market. And at any rate, if you are poor, it's very likely that you will find out yourself in a school where the quality of education is low. And so therefore your human capital will be low. And so the next generation, when these, you know, children will get older, it's very likely that they will find themselves in the informal sector and so on and so forth. There will be a vicious circle, which is quite alarming because, you know, we are talking about, roughly speaking, 1/4 of households in the poverty trap. So, I mean, you can't ask these people to be energy efficient. You can't ask these people to make isolation to their houses. You can't even ask these people not to burn coal. And not to mention that the government is giving them coal. I mean, that's quite another issue that we may want to. So basically, you know, Turkey may come up with some ad hoc adjustments to deal with the carbon border issue that Philipp mentioned, and Turkey is doing some preparations on that. But if you take the sustainability issue from a broader perspective, I think structural reforms are needed, and I would like to finish my presentation by putting forward two related questions. You know, where is the cook and who is the cook? You know, who will be responsible in initiating at least these reforms? And as such, I think I did my share, and back to you, Senem Hocam. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Fikret Hocam. And yeah, excellent question, multi-million-dollar question, which we cannot really easily find an answer to. You know, when there is a political will, there is often a way, as we've also been discussing. But the problem, I think, has to do with political will here on many fronts. Yes, and Çiğdem Hoca is with us, Çiğdem Nas, who is the Secretary General of Economic Development Foundation, also a professor at Istanbul Yıldız Technical University. And Çiğdem Hocam will speak, I think, a bit more about how this Green Deal will affect the Turkish industry. So we've talked about the deal, we talked about the climate targets, we talked about the potential social effects on Turkish economy in particular, on Turkish society, sorry. But then I think there's also the question of going into a bit more detail about, you know, how the Turkish industry and how Turkish businesses will have to adapt themselves, and, you know, what kind of reforms or changes are needed on that front. So, Çiğdem Hoca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and also for organizing this event. I have also a presentation, so let me share it. I will try to stick to my time limit. So as you said, I will try to focus more on the effects on Turkey and also, of course, the different economic sectors. Of course, the European Green Deal is a major transformation for, I think, the European economy, the European society. It's a new mindset of looking at production, transportation, consumption, and all related activities, as also Philipp has already underlined. Of course, it consists of several different strategies. So it's not just about one particular sector, but it is a mainstreaming of climate goals in all the different issue areas. So every, let's say every month, every 2 weeks, we see that the Commission is proposing a new strategy, a new initiative in this area. So all the policies are being reshaped, and also there are certain alliances which are being formed in order to implement these targets. Of course, when we look at the situation, the climate change is really causing alarm for the world, and we are day by day we are experiencing the effects of climate change. We are going through these effects, so I think it has become a much more urgent issue, which is now the center of attention for not only Europe but also for other parts of the world, and especially with the Biden administration, we have seen that the US has also returned to the system. And also, I think the concept of circular economy has also, I think, gained popularity, and the business world has become also a bit maybe accustomed to thinking in terms of circularity. This is a map which was provided by the European Commission, looking at the anticipated effects of climate change in Europe, in and around Europe. So, of course, when we are talking about the Green Deal, it's European Green Deal. So it also concerns countries like Turkey that are not members of the European Union. And the Mediterranean region is one of the regions which will experience, I think, the greatest effects of climate change, especially the increasing heat and temperatures, and also decrease in precipitation and river flows. So droughts and heat waves are to be experienced, which will cause a lot of problems, especially in terms of agriculture and other activities. Approaching the issue from the perspective of Turkey relations, of course, Turkey is a country which is still a candidate to join the European Union, although maybe the candidacy perspective is no longer really credible. Still, it is the process is still going on. I mean, the Commission is preparing its reports. Just yesterday, the Parliament has adopted its own report, and at the moment, there is a positive agenda on the table which has been proposed by the European Union, including maybe not a revitalization of the accession process, but an upgrading of the customs union relationship, a resumption of high-level dialogues, people-to-people contacts, and also cooperation in refugee and migration issues. As already also expressed, of course, the trade and investment relationship is still very important. Maybe it is one of the most important ties that keep the parties together, despite all the political upheavals and tensions. And this creates a necessity on the part of Turkey to adapt to the changes which will be precipitated by the European Green Deal. And of course, one major component of that is in order to adapt to the Green Deal, of course, there is a need for investment and funds, which may cause a problem, as Fikret Hoca has said, especially for a majority maybe of the population, I mean, making it to the other day is a major problem because of the economic problem. So thinking ahead and making plans, multi-annual plans is quite difficult at the moment. And of course, there is a need for more engagement between the parties. Looking at Turkey's case in terms of its role in the climate regime, we know that, of course, for example, the EU is responsible for about 10% of global emissions. Turkey, I think, is responsible for nearly 1%, so it's not a major emitter, but its share is rapidly increasing, as we see from the figures. Per capita emissions increasing to 6.6 tons, and also Turkey has also declared its aims regarding the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and it proclaimed its aim, its target of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 21% until 2030. However, this is a decrease from the expected increase that Turkey is expected until 2030. So the expectation is to reach about 1.17 billion tons by 2030, and the government has declared its goal of keeping this increase at 929 million tons. And there is no problem in reaching this aim because it's not a very ambitious goal. So I think there will be a necessity for Turkey to also upgrade its commitments under the global climate regime and the Paris Climate Agreement commitments. EU, of course, is, as we said, is a major trade and investment partner. Turkey is a part of European value chains. This, of course, will impact on Turkey and Turkish industry, especially in terms of the change in product regulations, standards and norms with regard to industrial production. So it will both find itself in terms of, let's say, the changing product designs, but also the method of production. For example, the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas emissions, and also the raw material and other inputs which are used in production. So all these have to be rethought and reevaluated with regard to the Green Deal commitments. One important factor in the Green Deal is the decoupling of economic growth from resource use. So in Turkey, I think we are still trapped in this cycle of using more resources in order to create growth, in order to develop, but without any regard or without significant regard for environmental impact of growth. So when you are trying to grow, but also by using resource more effectively, I think this will be one of the most important changes that the Green Deal will put pressure on Turkey. Mainstreaming of sustainability and climate change is another major issue because at the moment, neither the government nor major opposition parties actually are looking at issues from the perspective of the environment, sustainability, and climate change. So it is still seen as a separate policy area. However, it has now become part of each and every policy. So when we are debating Eastern Mediterranean question, we have to approach it from the climate change angle. Or when we are approaching, let's say, another issue like agriculture, structural problems of agriculture, we have to approach it from the climate change angle. So we have to mainstream this issue in all policy areas. And this is something which I think maybe on paper we are trying to do it, but not in spirit or in the really substance of policies. Circular economy principles and change in producer responsibility is also very important, because now with the, again, Green Deal principles, we see that these are becoming part of the production mechanism. Recycling, reuse, and the producer being responsible for the product until the end of its cycle, and then also being responsible for recycling. Here, this was already mentioned, but just to illustrate it maybe more specifically, for Turkey, of course, the EU market is very, very important. In 2020, about 41 to 42% of exports went to the European Union. And of course, the UK is no longer a member, but it was the second important export destination, Germany the first. And also in the top 10, we see other member states of the EU, like Italy, France, Spain, Netherlands. So we have to also, this puts the pressure to adapt to the changes in the European market, which will be triggered by the European Green Deal. In terms of investments also, this situation is very important. We see that about 60% of foreign direct investment flows to Turkey, again, originate from not only EU, but European countries. Europe is one of the major investors in Turkey. Of course, this relationship has become very problematic in recent years, and we see that the European countries are trying to redivert their investment from Turkey because of the political problems also, but still it's a very important investment relationship. This also necessitates Turkey to take into account the principles of the circular economy, especially the changes in product design, sustainable product policy framework, and green public procurement. So this is also a change in how we approach economy, how we approach industrial production, the relationship between producer and consumer. So it is changing all these issues. We can say that this is a change in mindset, actually, how we approach this issue, how we prioritize the impact of production on the environment and on climate. So these have become not only issues that are just noticed and focused on by environmentalist groups, but this has become a mainstream issue, which has been expressed by the Commission President many times. This dimension to it, and it also necessitates us to transform our relations with the environment and also the natural resource use. However, we see that Turkey is still prioritizing development goals, something which we see especially in such critical issues such as we experience in İkizdere at the moment, also very deep and maybe what we may call as corrupt relationships with some business circles are also diminishing the capacity of the state, I think, to be more active with regard to environmental principles, environmental impact considerations. Another important issue is the customs union modernization issue, and if we are going to start this process again, it will also have a very close relationship with the Green Deal principles, because this is an upgrade of the present relationship, and it has to take into consideration the changing norms, standards in the European market. Also, if we are going to expand the relationship to services, agriculture, and public procurement, again, we have to again take into consideration the changing principles and norms in agriculture, in different services, etc. So use of pesticides, use of antimicrobials, etc. All these will become major issues of adaptation. Regarding financing, again, we know that the EU is actually providing a lot of finance and investments, triggering investments to the Green Deal. And most of this investment is, of course, directed towards the present member states of the EU. However, Turkey is also one of the benefactors of the European Investment Bank credits. And we also see that getting finance and support for investments from such organizations as the European Investment Bank will be more and more dependent on, let's say, fulfilling the sustainability criteria. So we see especially that the EU is now adopting a green financing strategy. An EU taxonomy has been also announced, which provides requirements for non-financial reporting, sustainability reporting for companies. And also there are certain criteria which are being adopted for sustainable business. So this is also against greenwashing and to make sure that the sustainability investments will go to those sectors and those companies which are really making an effort to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions and to decrease their carbon footprint and also water footprint, etc., all the other related issues. So I think getting finance will also be more and more dependent on fulfilling these goals and fulfilling the climate targets. Also, I think this is also another issue which I wanted to add. Maybe it's not directly related with industry, but the Green Deal is also a governance model. So if you cannot form alliances, you cannot really succeed in the Green Deal. So it includes not only public actors, but private sector, civil society organizations, universities, regional and local actors. So it is a multi-actor and multi-level effort. It has to be. Otherwise, you will not be able to do it. So you have to convince these actors. You have to bring them into the fold. And this necessitates decentralization, transparency, engagement, and consultation with stakeholders. At the moment, again, the structure in Turkey is not really conducive to such a governance model. So I think we have to also take it into consideration. If the government cannot engage with the private sector, if it cannot provide strategies and coordination mechanisms for the other actors, economic actors, then this will not succeed. So it's not just about putting targets, but it's also facilitating the fulfillment of these targets by the different socioeconomic actors. So it is a multi-layered process, and we have to also take it into account. The state is only it provides a strategy, and it makes sure that this strategy is actually implemented, and it's not only a year-long strategy, but it should be a multi-annual strategy, and it should be a realistic strategy. So this is also another important issue. And lastly, of course, one of the most maybe important aspects of the Green Deal, and one which will maybe impact Turkey more directly, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which has not been yet announced by the European Union. And we also see some reports that maybe there may be certain delays. We expected the announcement of the plan for carbon border adjustment by June this year. However, maybe it may be postponed until after the conference of the parties in Glasgow later this year. However, it may be, I think, quite fair to expect the EU to come up with such a measure, because they want to prevent carbon leakage, and they want to make sure that the producers and the socioeconomic actors inside the European Union will not be disadvantaged when you compare other countries which do not really implement such climate targets. So it's maybe also seen as an aim of the European Union to maintain competitiveness and to act as a leader in setting global standards. So this may also turn to be a sort of a mechanism that will put pressure on Turkey to adopt maybe a carbon pricing mechanism, a similar mechanism to the emissions trading system in the European Union. So we have to make sure that the companies will be able to quantify their carbon footprint, and also there will be some effective strategies implemented to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions by industry, by agriculture, and by transport sectors. However, we should take into account that this should not turn into a non-tariff barrier or a disguised protectionism measure. There are also certain studies which have been made, like Professor Erinç Yeldan and Sevinç and also Sevinç Acar and Ahmet Atıcı had a very, I think, enlightening study for TÜSİAD, which also gave us some figures regarding the expected losses in terms of both exports and profits for certain sectors in Turkey. So this creates a very sort of direct threat for Turkish exports and a need for adaptation to these emission targets. So this is it, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, sorry, I sometimes forget to unmute myself, despite millions of online meetings in the year. Thank you so much, Çiğdem Hocam. That has been a very enlightening presentation about the potential economic impacts that on the industries, in particular on the Turkish economy, if Turkey stays behind the Green Deal, if it stays behind in terms of revising the customs union agreement, etc. And I think it's particularly important that we recognize this Green Deal as a model of governance. So it's more than just meeting this and that criteria, but it's actually a mode of governing. So it needs to be approached in a much wider context. All right. Now I'm going to open the floor for comments and questions from the audience. So if you do type your comments and questions in the chat box, then I can see these and I can group them in relation to who you're addressing. We already have one question from Pelin Oz to Philipp Godron. So we only have one question so far. So I'm going to shoot this question straight to you, Philipp, which is basically Pelin is asking whether you could elaborate a bit more on the power of the climate action in Germany, and in particular the factors that force the government to increase level of ambition of Germany's climate policy. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'll be happy to elaborate a little bit on that. I would say there are mainly three main drivers or also driving groups for that. One is, and this is well established, one that we have seen for decades, is the environmentalist movement, which has gained force. It's represented by the Green Party in Parliament, which for the first time ever has a realistic chance of even being the strongest party in the next parliamentary elections, and they have for decades made this their main one of their main political targets. Secondly, and that has come much more recently, but very forcefully, is really a youth movement around the Fridays for Future, which has become a very influential movement in Germany. It's not as visible publicly since the pandemic and the limitations to go to the streets, but they have really been able to establish a narrative very much around intergenerational justice, and they have been referring to this court ruling, which has now even given this a very strong legal backing. And thirdly, and that is of course also very important, there's a drive from business. With businesses seeing that low carbon technologies are the technologies of the future, that eventually the world, Europe, is moving in this direction, and it's about investment security for them. Take the energy intensive industry, steel, cement, chemistry. We have looked a bit at their investment cycles, and there's a major investment cycle coming up in the next decade. And whatever they're building, they want to run this for 2, 3, even 4 decades. So if they see that there is a strong push towards a lower carbon or even zero carbon technologies, they will want to avoid stranded investments by now investing again in the old technology. At the same time, being aware that currently many of these technologies still incur higher costs. So they are very much requesting investment security, but also support by the government to implement these technologies. So I think that's a very strong additional driver which is pushing the government, and really it has become mainstream. There's none. We see it now in the election campaign. No party, with some exception, when it comes to the still marginal right-wing party, can afford to not make energy transition, low carbon development not a core theme of the election campaign.
Thank you very much, Philipp. And we have two questions. Well, yes, from Elena Dük to both Fikret, Adaman and Çiğdem. Elena is asking about the sustainable development goals that Turkey emphasizes, if any. She's wondering which goals does Turkey actually emphasize the most? And how does this influence or offset the achievement of other sustainable development goals? So Fikret Hocam, shall we begin with you?
Thank you. Thank you, Elena, for this very stimulating question. Well, I would answer by saying that the incumbent government has been putting too much emphasis on the standard, well-known sort of tradition of developmentalism. That is to say, we should grow, we should grow, we should grow, and the growing economy will, at the end of the day, inshallah, solve, all kinds of problems that we are having today, including the social ones, including the environmental ones, and so on and so forth. But we need to grow, we need to get prosperous so that we can target these issues. And that sort of standpoint is still intact in Turkey. And when, we look at, what has been happening in terms of the 17 sort of goals, well, we don't see much emphasis being put on, dimensions like, gender equality, like inequality. Yes, I mean, sanitation, has been improved. Yes, drinking water is available almost in all households and so on and so forth. So therefore, perhaps we need to, question whether Turkey, for the time being, is capable, and willing to decouple its growth from ecological impacts. I mean, able, capable, and willing. I'm putting the emphasis on the last one, willingness. Well, of course, there have been some efforts, and of course, as Çiğdem Hoca mentioned, Turkey will be forced to deal with these issues one day or another. But that willingness, my final point is that political economy, which means that there are winners and winners. So it's not, we all win or we all lose. Some of us will win and some of us will lose. So how are we going to maneuver ourselves in that political environment constraint? That's the point that I would like to underline. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Çiğdem Hoca, if I pose the same question to you.
Thank you. I think especially I could say that the goals about energy and also infrastructure are mostly, I think, prioritized by the government, because we see a continuous search for energy projects. We know now the nuclear plant construction processes going on. We also have electricity power generation projects also in several places. So there's, I think, a search to increase especially the generation of electricity and energy. Here also, I think in terms of renewables, there is much potential in Turkey, which is not really tapped at the moment, I think, especially in terms of solar power, wind power. I think Turkey also has more potential, which it can make use of. Still, its, I think, share of renewables is not that bad compared to some EU member states. And also in terms of infrastructure, I think one of the major focus of this government was infrastructure projects, but they have also become, I think, sometimes unfeasible projects, as we have seen in the case of building of some airports, let's say, which weren't really used that much, or building of motorways, which are now being opened to the public at high prices, etc. I think these can be seen as major issues, again, related with what was said by Fikret Hoca, the development perspective, the developmentalist approach. And I think that also when we have interaction with the ministries, for example, we see that they have a lot of work in this respect. They try to prioritize sustainability goals in different public institutions, universities, research agencies. We also see a lot of effort in that, but I think there is also a discrepancy between the work going on in the level of the bureaucracy and the political decision-making process. I mean, there is a sort of a lack of communication or a disregard for what the work that is being done at the bureaucratic level. And also because of the political priorities and power calculations, I think, of the government, the SDG goals are not really taken into that much consideration, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Çiğdem Hocam. Now I'm going to turn to Philipp. To you again, because I think there are two questions that might be that you might perhaps illuminate us a bit more on. I mean, we talked a lot about the political will, the problem of political will in the Turkish context. But one of the questions also touch upon the question of political will in the European Union countries as well. I mean, in particular, you know, when we look at the EU, we see the rise of right-wing populist movements, authoritarian political parties in most EU member states. And there's a question from Batuhan Güneş on this as to how you think this would impact these targets, or whether this could impact the reaching of these targets. And a second question by Oğuz Türkilmaz is on how the zero carbon target was converted to carbon neutral and why. And he's also asking a question regarding the Energy Charter Treaty and how that would affect the Green Deal. So I'll pose these questions to you.
Thank you. And I'll excuse myself already that I may not have the full and comprehensive answer to these, but nevertheless, I will share some thoughts, and I will maybe start with the back, from the back. Energy Charter Treaty. Energy Charter Treaty, which is an old treaty protecting companies against, in a way, trying to provide security of investment in international relations. And the concern is indeed, and there's a debate around that, how this would impact transformative change, which certainly a decarbonization in the next 30 years and the Green Deal is going to be, and that companies and member states may sue each other, and that could also be, of course, the case with external parties. It's a challenge. It's been recognized as a challenge. There's a debate around that. The EU would like to amend the treaty, the EU Commission. There is dynamics within the different countries, which makes it not easy. And yes, there is the concern that there may be there may be financial hardship when there is legal challenge to that. So it's an unresolved question, I'd say. The zero carbon neutrality, well, I think again that's a broader debate where I'd maybe add just the point that there are areas where it seems very, very challenging to completely reduce carbon emissions to zero. Some industrial processes in agriculture, unless we completely change our consumption patterns, and there, I mean, I'm coming from the energy and power sector, but nevertheless, I think that the main reason around that is that there is some need for carbon offsetting, and what we see is biomass with carbon capture and storage is an option to offset some of these emissions, which cannot be completely avoided. And then the last question around the rise of right-wing parties and also regional differences within the European Union. Yes, that is certainly a challenge. And well, for one, there are, I mean, it's completely correct that there are very different interests, very different backgrounds, also very different levels of carbon footprints within Europe. Germany, despite some success, is still in the power sector. Also, industry has a very strong carbon footprint. There are some eastern and southeastern countries that have a strong carbon footprint. Poland, of course, when you look at the power sector, is very heavily relying on coal, and that makes discussions difficult. And that, and then if you couple this with the concern that this transformation may create losers, and may create losers in regions and countries where unemployment and social questions are of particular importance, then that's something we need to keep in mind. I think that's one of the reasons why the European Commission has, from the beginning, advocated for and publicly is addressing this question of a just transition and a transition mechanism. And there is a clear mechanism that will allow, I'd say it's probably a stick and carrot method, where regions and industries that are particularly affected, coal mining regions in Poland, if you take one example, can very much benefit from European funding and programs if, and that's the stick part, I guess, if they implement policies, the transformational policies. And that's certainly an attempt to deal with this challenge. We have, and maybe that's my last note on that, we are also collaborating strongly with partners in Poland, and we are very well aware of how difficult the situation there is, but there's very encouraging signs that the major utility in Poland, very much state-dominated, has set out a plan to decarbonize its business also to 2050. So things are moving, but it's not a one-directional thing, and there's many obstacles on the way, that's for sure.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Philipp. And now I'm going to pose Fuat Keyman's question, both to Fikret, Adaman, and also Çiğdem, because he's asking about the mechanisms by which Turkey in particular can adapt to the Green Deal and to the low carbon economy, and also help create jobs at the same time, so create employment. How is that going to be possible? What does it take to make it possible? Fikret Hocam?
Well, we need a cook.
Well, that's for sure.
Well, I don't want to be sound, as a, paternalistic sort of, paternalistic position. But what I have tried to underline in my presentation is that we need to come up with a set of reforms. And one of the areas where we need to focus on is to make the whole system, much greener. And technologically this is possible, but of course you need to put lots of fixed capital into that. So therefore you need to have a longer vision. And of course you need to have efforts be conducted at other levels to deal with the informality problem, to deal with the unemployment issue, and so on and so forth. And technically speaking, we basically know how to move from A to B, but moving from A to B won't be easy, because, well, there are some win and win issues, but in others, and perhaps in the most cases, some will lose and some will gain. And, well, the next generation will gain if we make that effort, but the current generation will lose something. So therefore, we need to, as Çiğdem Hoca mentioned, we need to change the paradigm, and change the paradigm at the political level. I mean, unless we have a political will, not only at the Ankara level, but at all levels. And of course, I do share with what Çiğdem Hoca mentioned. It's going to be a multi sort of multi-level issue, but that's with that paradigm change only we can answer Fuat Hoca's question. And technically speaking, we know the answer. Of course, the answer should be negotiated and so on and so forth, but basically we know the path. We know how to make the system greener. We know how to deal with the informality problem. We need this, we know that. And my final point is that, again, I would like to stress that, yes, the climate issue is number one. And of course, Mercator, basically deals with this issue. I would like to point out that there are other very serious environmental issues, problems. So we can't simply focus on the climate issue and forget other types of environmental and societal and economic problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fikret Hocam. Çiğdem Hocam?
Thank you. Of course, I think we can also maybe view this the circular economy as also maybe an opportunity, especially to deal with unemployment, because, for example, in the EU, there was a study which concluded that until 2030, the circular economy will create about 700,000 new jobs. So there will be losses in some sectors like coal, but there will be also maybe new opportunities. However, these new jobs will require new skills, of course. I mean, because they will not be conventional jobs, maybe. It will be about maybe recycling or providing advice to companies about carbon footprint, etc. In Turkey, I think there's also a potential, but and it may also maybe sort of an answer to our especially problem of youth unemployment, also unemployment among university graduates, I think, which is a major problem. So maybe these people can be educated in terms of this new Green Deal and the skills required in the circular economy, and because there will be a need for these human resources. So I think there can be sort of a click between our structural problems and what this Green Deal can provide to Turkey, or a similar transition process can provide for Turkey. But of course, it's not so easy because it requires a strategy, commitment, investment, etc. And it needs, I think, that Turkey should not be only reacting to these developments, but it should more actively engage and give more importance to climate diplomacy, start with ratifying the Paris Climate Agreement and be more active, because it will come anyway. All these changes will come. So it's better to welcome them and to try to make the most out of it. So trying to be optimistic, let's say, I could say that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Çiğdem Hocam. And so I'd like to thank all our three speakers for, I think, the excellent presentations, where I also learned a lot from. So every time I listen to you, I learn things, and I very much appreciate it. And I'd like to thank all the other attendees who asked their questions and comments. They were also very inspiring. So thanks very much for that also. And we're right on time, I think, for a break. So now we have roughly around 15 minutes or so. So we're going to get together at 4:45 Turkey time, of course, where in the second session, we're going to focus on migration, the issue of migration in the EU-Turkey relationship. So thanks very much, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.